It was time for me to move on. My SUV was parked in long-term parking at the airport. I figured that should give me about 2 weeks before someone notices the car had been there too long. I walked toward the Delta terminal carrying only my briefcase and a travel case. I had all my IDs in the briefcase, a few $1,000s in assorted bills, and my travel documents. Everything would appear perfectly normal unless you actually knew me. You see, all the documentation was in a different name, but where pictures were needed, they were my face. My driver's license and passport included. I was starting out on my new life with a new identity. I entered the terminal and started the process of going through the screening to board my flight. The TSA is a very efficient operation. They check my ticket, x-rayed my briefcase, my wallet, and my car keys. There are no bombs, water bottles, or other prohibited items in my case or on my person. They rightly guessed I wasn't a terrorist and passed me through. My next stop is the men's room, where I enter a stall and start removing my outer clothing. Underneath them, I have another set of clothes. I go from being a dressed businessman to a tourist returning from vacation. I have a gaudy shirt, shorts, and summery shoes on now. I exit the men's room and merge with the passengers from a flight returning from Las Vegas. I look like just another tourist returning from Fun City. I follow the crowd to the baggage claim. I walk over to a small, nondescript wheeled suitcase sitting by itself on the conveyor. Since there is no one paying any attention to this case, I snatch it and walk out the exit doors. I walk over to the inter-terminal transport and climb aboard. 10 minutes later, I exit the tram at another terminal. I stop at the men's room, remove another layer, and deposit it in the stolen suitcase. I approach the ticket counter, check my stolen bag, use one of my new IDs, and pick up my boarding pass. Instead of tackling the TSA checkpoint, I head to the area where all the shops are. I get lost in the crowds and slowly make my way to the exits. I am soon back on the tram and headed toward Continental's terminal. This time I am actually going to board a plane and leave the airport. Soon I am on one of their overseas flights. I have successfully changed myself into another person. My new life starts now. My wife, the cheating bitch, will never find me or any of my money. I think I'd better tell you what precipitated this exercise in identity change. I'll start by telling you about myself. I was born in Western New York State in 1960. I graduated from high school in about the middle of my class. I wasn't very impressive in my scholastic abilities or my physical shape. I guess you could say I was just a normal kid. My parents were not wealthy professionals. My mom was a stay-at-home mom, and my dad was a construction worker. I attended a local college and lived at home. I worked part-time at a fast food establishment during the school term and in construction with my dad over summer breaks. My college grades were nothing great. I just managed to carry a 2.6 for all 4 years. Between all the hours I worked, I didn't really apply myself to my schooling. I did just enough to get by. I graduated with my business degree and went out into the world to make my mark. What was I surprised when none of the big guys wanted to hire me? I guess my average grades from an average college in a simple business curriculum didn't actually stand out amongst all the superstar graduates. So I spent my time looking for work instead of a lofty position. I finally found a job with a small property management outfit. I wasn't given a private office with a secretary. I was given a desk, a phone, and a lot of responsibilities for little starting money. My college dreams of a white shirt, a dark suit, and 9 to 5 hours were dashed. I soon learned that in a small business, everyone was a jack of all trades. I harassed tenants for overdue rent. I helped with evictions. I interviewed prospective tenants. I even helped the maintenance staff clean and paint for new tenants. I didn't make a lot of money, but I learned the real estate business by doing everything. And in the process of learning, I fell in love. Not with a beautiful woman, but with the real estate business. My boss, the owner, noticed my burgeoning love for the business and guided me along. He had a couple of adult children, but none of them wanted to follow in his footsteps. I guess I became the child that he had always wanted. Someone he could pass his knowledge to. One day he called me into his office. "Billy, take a look at these bank foreclosures and tell me what you think might make a good investment for us," he said. "I've never done this sort of thing before," I alibied. "Don't worry, I'll check out your recommendations before taking the plunge." "Oh, I'd like your results right after lunch." Lunch at his company was 12 o'clock. It was now almost 10 o'clock. Shit, he didn't give me much time, I thought. I skipped lunch and spent the next 3 hours reading the listings. I found a few that I thought he might like. Promptly at 1 o'clock, I walked into his office and presented my recommendations. He listened to me for almost an hour before he interrupted. "So far, everything you picked is shit," was his only comment. "Come over here, and I'll show you how it's done," he added. We spent the rest of the week going over the choices. When we were done, we had selected a few properties that had a lot of potential. I learned a lot that week. I also learned my humble boss was a real estate genius. He bid on 4 of our selections and won only 1 bid. It was a 4-family apartment building built in the early 1910s. It was in a neighbor that was on the edge of an upscale area populated by young marrieds and college students. The building needed a lot of work, but we bought it really cheap, and the bank agreed to provide all the construction loans and postpone the mortgage payments for 6 months. What it all ended up meaning was that we bought the building for almost nothing down and had all the money we needed to fix her up. At closing, he handed me the keys and said, "It's your project. Get started tomorrow." For the next 6 months, I felt a greater range of emotions than a person should. I went from highs to lows and then back again. In between, I learned more about the rental business. By the time the first mortgage payment was due, I had all the apartments rented and was starting to cruise along. Soon after, my boss surprised me again. "Bill, sign these papers on that 4-family we bought." "Of course, but why?" I asked. "Because I'm transferring ownership over to you. It's your building now." "What?" I exclaimed. "Bill, I'm getting old and I'd like to pass my knowledge on to someone. I hope you'll let me pass it to you. My children will probably sell off all the property I own when I die, as is their birthright. So we'll start you on to your own real estate business. Please accept my little gift to you." So that's how I started. I soon became Bilko Properties, LLC. My friend and mentor died about 5 years later. True to his prediction, his children sold everything off. They wanted top dollar for everything and found a buyer who was willing to pay the price. By that time, I had 15 properties of my own. They were all in good areas and all fully rented. My financial blueprint was factored on 50% rentals. By that I mean if half a building is rented, it pays all the cost for that building. Most of my buildings ran 100% occupancy. I wasn't rich, but I wasn't in trouble either. I was doing okay. I picked up a few commercial properties when the guy that bought my late boss's business went bankrupt. He thought that hiring a lot of help and then spending all his time on the golf course was all that was needed. To my advantage, I guess he was wrong. I was 30 years old when I met the woman who was eventually to be my wife. I had purchased a piece of commercial property in a fairly good neighborhood. She and a girlfriend rented one of the office suites to start a decorating business. When they met me, I was dressed as I usually did, as just one of the other workers. They were both dressed to the nines, right out of a fashion magazine. I guess that as interior decorators, they needed to make an impression. Well, they did make one on me. Wendy was the more aggressive partner. She captured my heart. In my little mind, I saw her standing in front of a vine-covered cottage with 2 small children, awaiting her husband to return from work. I pictured myself as that husband. When I quoted the rent to them, I could tell by their faces that they couldn't afford the place. "Since this is a fairly empty building," I lied, "there was only one other vacancy. I can let you have an introductory rent for the first year," I offered. "How much lower?" they asked in unison. "About half, if that's not too much. The owner gives me a bit of flexibility on setting introductory rates." They jumped on my generosity and signed a 1-year lease with an option on another year, rent to be determined later. "Can we have the owner's name and address so that we can thank him?" Wendy asked. I gave them my mother's maiden name with a phony first name and the company's P.O. box. I explained that the owner did not like people bothering him, so sending a short note would be sufficient. For the next year, I helped them with all their problems dressed as just another worker. I watched their little business slowly take off. By the start of their second year, they renewed their lease at a higher rate, the rate still being about 25% lower than every other tenant was paying. As I said earlier, they were really beautiful. Wendy, that's the one I liked, informed me one day that her partner was getting married and would be moving to the West Coast with her new husband before their lease was up. She asked, "Can I get out of our lease? I don't think I can afford it with my partner leaving." "I don't know about breaking your lease, but I can still reduce the rent back to its former level." My boss doesn't like empty office suites. The truth being that I didn't want to see her leave. Her face lit up in a great big smile and I got a kiss. The kiss sealed it for me. I was in love. After we separated, she gave me a different kind of look and a special smile. That was the start of our relationship. 1 year later, I found myself standing at the altar taking my vows. By the time we were married 1 year, our daughter was born. Wendy had a hard time with the pregnancy and the delivery. Her doctor recommended no more children for her. She had her tubes tied. Our sex life was still as good as it had always been, but her desires to have sex diminished. Mine didn't. Wendy put her efforts into her business from then on. She never realized that I was a lot more than a simple flunky for some rich landlord. She started treating me with little respect. She began seeing herself as the main breadwinner in the household. I tried to tell her that I really owned a bunch of property, but she never gave me a chance. Every time I started to tell her I don't want to hear about your work. It's boring. I accepted her opinion of my worth to keep my family. She was still beautiful and I was just average. By accepting her put-downs, I was able to keep my beautiful wife and daughter. My daughter soon became the love of my life. If I wasn't working on a real estate deal, I was spending every available minute with my daughter. Watching that little girl grow was my only reason for staying alive. Wendy and I just drifted further apart. She was seduced away from me by her rich and powerful customers. But I kept buying property. Some pieces I kept for the long haul, and others I quickly resold, making a tidy profit. I was slowly amassing a fortune that she knew nothing about. Wendy became more and more contemptuous of me and more distant. Soon I was delegated to sleeping in the spare bedroom. The reasons for my banishment were listed as snoring too much, tossing and turning and keeping her awake, and of course, smelling like a petty worker. At first I was allowed to visit her bed weekly, but eventually it dropped off until I was lucky if it was once a month. The only reason I put up with this was my daughter. If I confronted Wendy and she divorced me, everyone knows that the mother gets the kid and the husband gets the bills. I loved my daughter way too much to accept being cut out of her life by a selfish wife. I channeled my frustration and loneliness into my real estate business. I ran my company like a secret mission with a great passion. I had interlocking corporations, multiple P.O. boxes, different office fronts, and most of my employees worked out of different buildings. In my main office, there were only 2 people, my trusty bookkeeper and me. Everyone but my bookkeeper just thought I was another worker there. I never corrected their misconceptions. By the time my daughter, Amy, was 15, I owned about $25 million in property that was mortgage-free and another $50 million with some form of mortgage debt. They were in various corporate names at various addresses for those corporations. All the rents went into different P.O. boxes. Some of the rent disappeared into offshore numbered accounts to avoid taxes on it. I was starting to be worth some serious money by now. I owned almost 100 properties. No longer were they the simple 3- and 4-family apartment buildings I started with. They were large apartment complexes, strip malls, commercial office space in 10 to 20-story buildings, and one large shopping mall. Amy and I formed a bond over the years. I was the parent who was there for her. If she had a sport, I was in the stands cheering. If she was sick, I sat by her bedside and held her hand. She and I spent hours at the mall together buying all those things a mother and daughter usually did. Except Amy's mother was too busy with her wonderful life, and it was up to me to fill in with our daughter. Wendy was doing well in her business by then also. Since I never bragged or changed my lifestyle, she still considered herself as the real moneymaker in the family. I never corrected her because by now, I didn't want her thinking I might have money and divorce me. My wife looked at me as if I was nothing more than a failure leeching off her success. She no longer hid her contempt for me. To be a second-class citizen in our home, I'd need a promotion. While I accepted her attitude toward me, I also started hiding more of my wealth offshore. When Wendy decided to upgrade, I didn't want to be left penniless. Wendy's business as a decorator required that she hire very artistic people. I guess I was a bit homophobic because these guys bothered me. Wendy noticed that I was bothered by them and tried to make my life miserable every time I was in her office. She went out of her way to make the gayer ones my helpers. The boys had a hard time keeping their hands to themselves. Wendy just enjoyed the shit out of these times. I didn't. This was just another way for Wendy to show her contempt for me, but I accepted her treatment. In order to stay in my marriage and with my daughter, I turned into a chicken. Now let's hear the story from Wendy's perspective. My husband Bill was a nice enough guy, but he had no ambition. I was a go-getter, always trying to improve our lot in life. Bill was just holding me back. Okay, he was an average lover and the father of only child. He treated our daughter as if she was a princess. He was always there for her, but he did nothing for me. I wonder what I saw in him. He was just average. He was content in a dead-end job working for a reclusive real estate giant as a gopher. He was always a nice guy when I was starting my business with my friend Millie. He was like the landlord's gopher. I was able to wrap him around my little finger and get all sorts of concessions on the rent as well as a lot of extras. During our second year of business, Millie and I decided that we were not meant to be partners. I was the aggressive one. If the client was male, I flirted and let him think there might be a chance if he gave his business. If the client was female and by curious, well, I satisfied her curiosity for her business. Millie was not me. She had morals. I liked fooling around. Millie and I parted before our second year in business was completed. She moved along with her boyfriend to the West Coast. I was being so rotten to her that she just left, leaving me the business and all assets. I gave her nothing in return. I was a little concerned if I could afford the full rent on my fancy office suite without Millie's help, so I turned my feminine charms toward Bill. I got the lowered rent for another year. I kissed him for the first time as a thank you and a tease. But after the kiss, I discovered I liked kissing him. I'm not sure the reason. Maybe it was because I had not had a good session with my lovers in over a month. I guess I was a little needy. For all Bill's downsides, he was a pretty good lover. Bill was very considerate. Like the old saying, ladies first, was always his goal. I was used to inconsiderate male lovers. Men who cared only for their own pleasure, leaving me unsatisfied most of the times. I wasn't into women except to win their business. I always made sure they were satisfied, but that was business. But Bill was just so boring outside of the bedroom. He didn't keep up to speed on current events, or popular authors, artists, or other famous people. If anyone tried to carry on a conversation with him at a party, they soon gave up. All Bill could discuss was real estate and bookkeeping, and those were two subjects that bored most of my friends to death. I tried taking him to the opera, Philharmonic concerts, and current plays. All that happened was I fought to keep him awake because if he snored, I wouldn't be embarrassed. Because I was in the decorating business, I was required to attend various charity functions to promote myself and be seen. When I brought Bill to these functions, he usually just sat at our table and contributed nothing to the evening. He didn't even dress that nicely. He was more of a liability than an asset there. I guess I should have worked on his image, but I was just too busy expanding my business. One day I received an invitation to a charity event. This time I did not tell Bill until it was too late for him to change his previously made plans. Bill, I'm going to the event even if you can't attend. It's important to my business, and you know that I am responsible for our standard of living. I argued. But Wendy, won't it look bad if you attend alone? Bill asked. I'll bring one of my decorators with me. He'll be just visibility enough that no one will mistake him for a lover. It was at this event I met James, the man who was to become my lover. I was standing at one of the bars looking for my date. I suspected that he had snuck off with one of the other guys at the party, leaving me to fend for myself, when this handsome man struck up a conversation with me. Excuse me, but I couldn't help but notice that your escort has deserted you, James said. My name is James William Hawthorne, and I'd like the pleasure of your company this evening, if you'll allow me. The first thing that went through my mind was, God, he's gorgeous. He was well-dressed, well-spoken, and appeared wealthy. I accepted his offer for the evening. We had a ball together. In the taxi on the way back home, I noticed that I had become excited. I knew it wasn't Bill that brought this feeling around this time, but James. About 1 week later, I got a phone call from James. Hi, Wendy. Would you like to join me for lunch? I have an office that I was thinking of redoing and would like your opinion. That's how it all started. Within 1 month, we were lovers. We started meeting 2 or 3 afternoons a week in various hotels. He was my lover. Now, I'm not saying that he was better than Bill. Bill always thought of my pleasure first. James never did. James treated me like a bitch, Bill like a queen. It was exciting being with James, even if he just used me. He made me do things that Bill never would have thought of. There were days that I hurt from all the things James made me do. I was a submissive female, and he was a dominant male. To James, I could never refuse him anything. I grew bored with Bill's gentle loving. I wanted James' mastery. I was all his. He even started bringing other men to our bed. I never wanted this to stop, so I decided that I wanted an apartment of my own. This would be where James and I could start spending all our free time together. So I made a plan and put it in action. Bill, I began. I'm going to rent an apartment in the city. I am spending too much of my time commuting between my office and this ugly farm. It's almost an hour one way, and I could better be off putting that extra time toward my work. I know you love this farm, but I need to be closer to the city. You and Amy can stay here. There is no need for your lives to be disrupted. But Wendy, he began. I cut him off. This is not open to discussion. I have my mind made up. I have already picked out one of two choices, and I'll be moved in by the end of the month. I then saw the hurt look in Bill's eyes. Don't worry, honey. I'll still be home weekends for you and Amy. I went about my plans. James helped me pick out a very upscale apartment just minutes from my office. To make Bill feel a part of this, I showed him the apartment and asked him if he approved of my choice. Before he could respond, I said, I knew you'd just love it too. I'll use it to highlight my decorating ability. When we left the building, I noticed that the building manager knew Bill. I just assumed that they had met at some real estate function Bill was always attending. Meanwhile, Bill, on the day Wendy got an apartment in town, so that she didn't have the long drive back to our house in the country every day, or so she said. I knew my marriage was over now. I had suspected that she'd taken a lover, but until now I just wasn't sure. Now I was sure. Wendy never knew that I owned that apartment building. It was one of my more upscale units. My manager saw me and wanted to talk, but I pretended we were only acquaintances, not employer or employee. He later talked to me about my wife and her lover. My heart broke. I guess I still loved Wendy, but I didn't know how I was going to survive this transgression by her. The only thing I could do was get enough evidence of her cheating and poor moral character that I might be named custodial parent. My manager told me that my wife and her lover picked out the apartment together, and he filled out the application with her. They had rented the apartment together. It was their love nest. He and I decided to wire the apartment for video and audio before Wendy could move in. I had more than enough money to hire the work done and the equipment installed in the manager's office. The tenants thought there was a new building security system being installed. This time I made sure Wendy paid the full rent. Actually, it was a little higher than all the other units. But since her current boyfriend paid the tariff, I didn't care. I made sure the apartment was in our name because I didn't want any alert lawyer to claim that the information I was gathering through the video and audio recordings was inadmissible in court. I began collecting my evidence for a divorce. Since Wendy had now effectively moved out of our home, my monthly visits to her bedroom stopped. While she had promised that she'd be home on weekends, she never did. When Wendy decided to anoint our daughter Amy and I with a visit home for the weekend, Amy was thrilled to have her mother around again. Amy was at that age when she needed a mother around. She needed to bond with a female and make girl talk and all that stuff. Dad just didn't measure up anymore. Amy started idolizing her mother and Wendy's lifestyle. I figured this was just a phase Amy was going through, so I played along. Little did I know how wrong I was. When Wendy did bless me with a visit to my bed, I could not perform any longer. I kept seeing the videos with her lover and hear their sounds of their sex session. I could hear him belittling me as he screwed her, and her agreeing with him that I was inadequate as a lover and a man. Bill, what is wrong with you? She asked after an unsuccessful attempt. We haven't had sex in months, and you can't even get excited. If I didn't know better, I'd swear you had a girlfriend. I'm sorry, Wendy, but I've got too much on my mind to perform. I'll do better next time. I promise. Next time never came. Wendy's boyfriend sent the rent checks for her apartment to a rent collection P.O. box where they eventually got to me. I copied them and deposited the originals in the bank. A lot of you are wondering why I didn't get a little revenge on him while he screwed my wife. Don't be disappointed, I did. The bank manager I did my company business with was a good friend of mine, as well as a good friend of the manager of my wife's lover's bank. Just for fun, we started watching his finances. We soon knew he lived too close to the edge, and we wanted to help him over. After a couple of months, we noticed a pattern in his finances. It seems he was a little short of cash every couple of months and depended on the float time between deposits and withdrawals to stay afloat. His accounts were enough short of cash that if his rent check on my wife's apartment was deposited at certain times of the month, they would be returned for insufficient funds, or, better yet, cause a few of his wife's checks to be returned for insufficient funds. Get the picture? So we started playing games with his accounts. Soon not only was he getting dinged by my company with return check fees and late rent charges, but he was paying bank fees on the checks that his wife wrote, which were being returned also. Soon a lot of her checks, to her embarrassment, were being refused by her favorite stores. Even some of her girlfriends started asking for cash from her if they split a lunch check. Our plan was working perfectly. Because of all these hits for return checks and fees, his credit rating was lowered. His credit card companies didn't like that. While they didn't actually close his accounts, they pulled another better stopper. They kept lowering his credit limit to exactly what he owed, effectively stopping him from charging anything. This also affected his wife's use of the joint cards. As you can imagine, she was a little upset by this because no woman wants her credit card declined. I enjoyed the shit out of these times. Not only was he being dinged for $200 to $300 in late fees and return check charges, he also had to explain to his wife how these mistakes were happening without mentioning it was the fault of my wife's apartment complex and their depositing habits. Oh, I bet there were some interesting conversations over family finances at his house. My next break was sent from heaven. My wife had visited her doctor for female problems. Her pap smear returned indicated that she had some form of cancer. Our relationship was such by that time that she didn't tell me anything about it. She only informed me that she was having some female problems and needed surgery. The truth came out when my then 17 going on 18-year-old daughter, Amy, let the cat out of the bag. She told me that she was going to stay with her mother. Amy, why? I asked. Have I been that bad a father to you? No, Dad, you haven't. But Mom needs me. She has ovarian cancer. And you don't love her anymore, but I still do. I want to help my mother get through these next months until she's better. I missed my daughter, but I needed to complete my plans. If Amy chose to be with her mother over me, so be it. As much as I wanted my daughter to be with me, she chose her mother. I guess she really needed to help her mother to be complete. Amy was all grown up now. And besides, living with her mom might reveal to Amy what a bitch her mother actually was. I went to church the next Sunday. It had been years since I set foot in the Lord's house, but I wanted to take the time to thank Him. That's right, I wasn't praying for Wendy's recovery, but thanking the Lord for giving her cancer. It was the nicest thing He could have done for me. Wendy was suffering and Wendy's lover was paying the full shot but getting nothing in return. He got to clean up Wendy's vomit, watch her hair fall out, watch her lose weight and become more of a Halloween decoration than a human being. I watched on one of the tapes how he treated Wendy. He would leave her lay in her own filth until he was good and ready to help her. Amy must have noticed because she was the one taking care of her mother. I made an appointment with my attorney. I explained that I wanted out of my marriage with no financial loss except his fees. I also wanted him to make sure Loverboy's wife had all the information she needed to clean him out. He gave me the usual talk that this was a no-fault state and everything would be split 50-50. Not a chance, I thought. I had other plans. I left all the video and audio evidence as well as copies of all the rent checks paid by my wife's lover on her apartment through his account and the rental application signed by Loverboy and Wendy. I wanted him to compile all the paperwork, but not serve it until I told him to. My next step was to sell off all my properties. I had to do this slowly because I didn't want to depress my holdings too much in value. In this endeavor, I was very lucky. First, the real estate market was booming, and there were a couple of real estate firms entering our market. Since the new firms were competing with each other, they kept getting into bidding wars over some of my better properties. I usually ended up getting more than I had expected. I was quite pleased. In the meantime, I slowly cleaned out the house of all our personal possessions and sold it. Closing was set to happen after my wife the day after my wife was served. After about 6 months, I gave my lawyer the signal to release to Loverboy's wife everything she needed to divorce him. He moved into my wife's apartment with my wife and daughter after his wife threw him out. They were a happy family until they realized that they had no money. His wife froze all his assets, and I made sure my wife's accounts were emptied into my offshore accounts. They were both as poor as church mice. My building manager, Phil, from my wife's apartment called and left a message for me one day. All it said was, "Look at the video I am sending you today. Your daughter is in trouble." I had stopped reviewing the video from Wendy's apartment months ago. My lawyer said we had more than enough evidence of her adultery for the divorce. So naturally, I was concerned when I got the call from Phil, my building manager. A messenger service dropped of the CD that afternoon. The CD was in chronological order. It started about 4 months ago. It started with Loverboy drugging my daughter and assaulting her. Amy cried for hours, but did not leave. All she kept crying was, "Why did you let it happen, Mommy?" The clips went on to show Loverboy assaulted and tortured her. I watched my daughter descend into the life of an addict. She would beg for her medicine. He was soon had Amy begging him not to hurt her. I watched the videos that were taken from my wife's bedroom. She was awake and listening to Amy being forced. I could see the tears in her eyes, but she did nothing to stop him. She was too far under his control to stand up to his personality. It was too late to protect Amy from Loveboy and his friends now. Amy was a willing partner as long as the drugs kept coming. These clips covered a time span of about 4 months. It was too late for me to help my little girl. I called my attorney at 4 a.m. when I stopped crying and left him a message. The message asked him to save her, to get her out of that apartment before someone killed her. I knew she was 18 now, and there was nothing legally I could do, but I had to try. Amy was still my little girl. While I still had few feelings for Wendy, I could not ignore what was happening to our daughter. The next day, he returned my voicemail. He said he'd look into saving Amy, but she was an adult now, and there was not much he could do. Later that day, he called back. Alan indicated that my 18-year-old daughter was pregnant and claiming my wife's lover was the cause. He was making her sell her body and keeping her on drugs, crystal, so she wouldn't resist. He also added, one night while Loverboy and Amy were working a hotel bar, the client turned out to be an undercover cop. Loverboy was arrested for contributing to the delinquency of a minor and bunches of other prostitution and drug charges. I didn't figure he'd beat the charges, but just in case, I sent the tapes from Wendy's apartment to the police and the local news media. With all the publicity the tapes caused, I was sure Loverboy would never work in the town again. The publicity also gave his wife more leverage in the divorce settlement. Loverboy was in jail awaiting trial because he couldn't make bail. My daughter was also incarcerated because there was no money for bail. Alan, my lawyer, and I discussed Amy. Alan said that I should leave her in jail, and he would see that she was put in a treatment program. He explained that if I put up her bail, she would just become another addict on the streets. It was best to leave her where she could get some treatment, and he could keep an eye on her. Later that day, I used the video and managed to Photoshop just the men's faces. 3 weeks later, they were found beaten to death in an alley behind their favorite bar. Lucky for him, Loverboy was in jail, or he would have joined them in death. You see, one of my storefronts was rented by some guys with connections to organized crime. They owed me a favor. In the meantime, my wife had been paying no attention to her business while she was undergoing her treatment program. A couple of her employees started their own decorating business, with my help of course, and quit my wife taking most of her customers. Her business failed and her landlord, guess who? Evicted her from her office suite. She was broke and had no source income. There was no health insurance for her. She called me asking to be put on my policy, which I did. But the policy I had did not cover existing conditions. I had always been good at planning ahead. Well, that brings me to the present times in my tale. I was on a plane heading to South America. There was no way I could be traced. Soon I would be landing in Cancun, and I would make another identity switch as I grabbed a plane to Europe. In Europe, I would make yet another switch and head to warmer climes. This way my wife could never locate me, nor could the local police if they looked for me in connection with the beatings. I called my lawyer, Alan, before I left for Australia. Alan informed me that my daughter, Amy, was trying to get in touch with me. She wanted to reconcile with me. He told me that somehow she had found out about all my wealth. My lawyer told her I was long gone, and there was no way I could ever be found again unless I wanted to be found. I told Alan to use some of my money to prepare a defense for Amy. I also told him to leave her in jail as long as possible because she was making progress toward kicking her drug habit while in there. I felt if she was back out on the streets, she'd fall back into her old habits. From everything I could find out, crystal was a nasty drug to kick. I learned that it usually took 3 to 4 relapses before a user could get clean, if they really wanted to. I called my lawyer 6 months later to inquire about the status of my divorce. My attorney informed me that there was no divorce needed. My wife had lost her battle with her cancer and died before the divorce was final. Because she had had no money and we weren't divorced, I was responsible for the costs of her treatments. She died in a charity ward in the hospital. She had no visitors while dying. She died alone and in pain. I paid all her medical bills. I guess I actually did feel a little guilty. She was the love of my life, but her actions and greed drove us apart. Yet she still held a small place in my heart. I was out of the country, hiding, and my daughter Amy was in jail when Wendy died. There was no funeral service for Wendy. Alan said, her ashes are waiting at the county coroner's office for someone to claim them. If no one showed up to claim them, she'll be buried with all the other indigent persons in an unmarked grave. Alan stopped talking and waited for me to respond. I guess he was waiting for me to offer to be responsible for Wendy's remains. No way, I thought. She had caused me too much pain and humiliation over the years for me to forgive her now. I fooled him and asked about my daughter. She lost the baby in the 4th month to an STD. Currently, she is in jail serving a 12-month sentence for the oldest profession and drug possession, but she's in a good addiction program and seems to be making progress. How about Loverboy? I asked. I already knew what became of him because my friends took care of him for me, but I wanted to play dumb. He died in a fight in the yard in prison. They don't like his type of criminal in jail. Well, if Amy asks you about making arrangements for her mother, give her the money necessary. If she's clean and drug-free, support her on my dime until she completes her education and can support herself. If she's not clean, then give her enough so she can OD. Then bury them both in unmarked graves. I replied, I know that sounds mean, but I'd rather have my daughter dead than living the life of an addict on the street. If she OD'd, she would give up life with no suffering. If she lived on the street, she would still die, but at the hands of some pimp. I didn't want her to suffer if she couldn't kick her addiction. But somehow if Amy managed to beat the odds, recover, and stay drug-free, I guess I'd make sure she had enough money for a second chance. Hell, I had millions. What's a few dollars for my kid? Maybe, just maybe, she'd beat the odds. It was 4 years later when I stopped in town to visit Alan, my old attorney. We hadn't talked in years. He was retiring and closing down his practice. I wanted to stop by, wish him well in his retirement, and present him with a monetary gift. He was a good friend. Actually, he was my only friend. I was a lonely old man. No one gave a shit whether I lived or died except him. As I drove my new Bentley through town, I relived a lot of memories. Some of them pleasant and some, well, you know. I took the extra time to drive around and visit some of the property I once owned. Most of the areas I had picked for owning apartments and had prospered over the years. My old holdings were looking good. Most of my old commercial property also showed signs of gaining in value. Too bad divorcing Wendy had forced me to sell these units and hide my wealth. I always wondered if I had told Wendy about all my holding, she might have respected me more. It was too late now for that experiment. I parked in front of my attorney's offices and went in. The building was one of the few I still owned. I kept it because of it being home to my lawyer's practice. I wanted to keep him safe so he could look after my interests. I wanted to deed the building to him now so that he would have something to provide for his old age now that he was retiring. That was my gift to him. Hi, you old scumsucker. Alan, my lawyer greeted me. It takes on to know one, I replied. We then hugged and shook hands. The intervening years just disappeared as we both started telling the other all the things we had done over those years. When we finally slowed down, he said, "Aren't you going to ask about your daughter, Amy?" "Not really, but I'll bet you were going to tell me anyway." "Actually, Bill, you'll be proud of her. When she was released from jail, she entered another drug rehab program. She completed the whole program and then stayed on as a counselor. She kicked her addiction." Alan continued. "Whoopee," the sarcastic part of me exclaimed, while a secret part of me was glad she made it. "No, really. Amy stayed there and also enrolled in a social worker program at our local college. She has done really well. She completed the 4-year course in 3 years. She graduates next month. I was informed. Besides, you paid for it all. I took a liberal interpretation of your instructions. One other thing, Bill, you might want to meet your son-in-law, Frank Murphy, and your granddaughter, Vivian. The baby is almost 7 months now, and she's starting to develop a real personality now. She's going to be a real beauty when she grows up. A real heartbreaker. Just like her grandmother, I thought. A real heartbreaker. Alan continued. You also paid for all their costs above and beyond what his meager income would cover, including a nanny named Chloe. I put her in the apartment across the hall from the kids and had her pretend to be nothing more than a helpful neighbor who was bored in her retirement and wanted to help. Her being available all the time to babysit and stuff allowed Amy to continue her studies and allowed Frank to progress in his job. I gave into the pressure being applied and agreed to remain in town through the graduation and watch the event. When the graduation approached, Alan somehow arranged for us to attend not only the graduation ceremonies, but the pre- and post-events also. At one of the pre-gatherings, I spotted my daughter and her husband. I was impressed. It had been years since I had seen Amy, and she had inherited her mother's beauty. I had always known that my daughter had inherited her mother's genes, but Amy turned out to be a real beauty. Amy was the spitting image of her mother, the only woman I had ever loved. I felt a little sadness in my heart. I guess that this graduation might be a little harder on me than I thought. I took my friend away from the crowd and said, I don't want to get involved in Amy's life anymore. So don't expect me to run up and greet them. It's just too hard. Promise me that. I promise, he answered. The next day, Alan and I sat about midway in the stands. We heard the graduating student being announced as they crossed the stage. Their parents and friends applauded or cheered as the diplomas were presented. When my daughter's turn came, her husband stood with their baby in his arms. I could see his tears from where I sat. The applauses sounded louder for her than for the others. I felt a little pride in my heart. When my daughter reached the center, the dean stopped her. It is with great pleasure I present this special award to you, Amy Murphy. You were selected by your fellow students and by the facility for this distinction. Mrs. Murphy, you are being honored for your unselfish gifts to anyone who needed any encouragement. We all feel that because of your actions, more of your peers have graduated in this class than any other class in the history of the school. The dropout rate since you started here is almost zero. Along with your diploma, you will find a certificate of appreciation signed by all members of this class as well as the facility. Amy, we all love you and will miss you. As Amy crossed the stage, she received a standing ovation. I was as proud a parent as I had ever been. I guess that at this moment I felt more for her than I did when she was born. My little girl had turned out really well. I was glad for her. Once the ceremony was over, I started back to my car. But with all the students and visitors, the aisles were jammed. As I shuffled out with the crowd, I tried to keep my head down so I would not be recognized. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw my daughter, her husband, and my grandchild walking up the aisle near me. Shit, I thought. I need a hole to open up so I could climb in and hide. I couldn't find one, so I was trapped. My daughter and her husband did not notice me, but my granddaughter did. I watched her out of the corner of my eyes as she watched my every move. She kept a grip around my son-in-law's neck while watching me. By now she was nearing 9 months and appeared to have a mind of her own. In her little kid voice, she started chanting, Bopa, the term many children called their grandfathers. She started chanting and waving her arms and kicking her feet, trying to get out of her father's grip. Amy reached over to take the baby from her husband when she glanced where the baby was pointing. Unknown to me, Chloe had been showing my granddaughter my picture and trying to explain who I was. The kid really learned her lesson. To her credit, Amy didn't scream or pass out. All she said was, Hi, Dad. Thanks for coming and supporting us all these years. Alan spilled the beans to us about a month ago about your involvement in our lives. I found out later that he had kept this small family under his protection for many years. He also let Amy know it was my money she was using to pay for her education and incidental expenses for all these years. He was playing the father I couldn't, but still giving me credit for it. I looked at her and smiled. I wouldn't have missed your graduation for all the tea in China, and paying your expenses was the least I could do. After all, it was I who left you on your own. Amy's husband looked at me and stumbled. He really didn't exactly know how to handle the reunion. I caught his arm to steady him. My granddaughter grabbed my shirt and started yelling, "Bopa, Yuppie." My daughter, Amy, spoke first. "Vivian wants you to hold her, Dad. Would you like to carry your granddaughter?" Before I had a chance to make a decision, I found myself carrying a very excited little girl. She was hugging me around my neck and telling everyone in earshot that I was Bopa. I was hooked. This little child had wormed her way into my heart. Suddenly, I was a grandfather, father, and father-in-law and loving every minute. My years of loneliness appeared to be over. My heart started to heal. Soon we were standing in one of the large parking lots with Alan, my attorney. "Bill, let's get in your car and head to a restaurant so you can get reacquainted with your family. There are a lot of years to cover." My son-in-law, Frank, flipped when he realized we were walking up to a Bentley Mulsanne, $300,000 worth of finely crafted automobile. He just stopped and stared, amazement showing on his face. I handed him the keys. "Want to drive, son?" I asked. The glow from his grin overpowered the lights in the parking lot. I guess he wanted to drive. We drove across the lot to his beat-up old Ford to get the car seat and everything else required when traveling with a small child. I looked at the car and made my decision. Tomorrow he was getting his own set of keys to the Bentley. I'd get myself another car later. Once underway, I found myself sitting in the back next to my granddaughter, who was between Amy and I. Little Vivian held onto my arm, chattering to me like any small child. A rather large lump developed in my throat. "Dad, we have a lot to talk about," Amy said. "I need to do a lot of apologizing to you. I was a stupid, selfish kid. I never realized how much me leaving to go to Mom hurt you. No, you don't need to apologize. I'm proud to see that you got your life turned around and now have a great little family. And I finally realized that you needed your mother all those years ago, and she needed you too. I just sorry both of you had to be taken advantage of by that James creep." "But Dad," I interrupted by saying, "I like to be a part of your new life, if you'll have me. I too made a lot of mistakes in our relationship, and I'd like to make it up to you. We have a lot to discuss, and I hope I never see that James again. He ruined my mother with his lies and me with drugs. If Frank hadn't found me, I'd still be in jail or dead from an overdose. It took until my 4th try before I overcame my addiction. Frank was the reason I succeeded. His love helped me overcome that final hurdle. Now little Vivian is my reason for staying clean. There is so much I, as her mother, want to share with her." Amy cried, not out of sadness, but with a sense of family for most of our ride. I guess she finally felt complete. All through dinner, the next day at their apartment, and the days after at my hotel, we talked. We actually talked for the next month. We reconciled all those years of pain and loneliness. We eventually blamed all our problems on my late wife and her attitude toward me. We agreed that Wendy was a selfish individual. She paid no attention to anything but her own wants. Wendy was beautiful on the outside, but empty on the inside. But I still missed her. I knew that no one on this earth would ever replace her in my heart. My daughter Amy came to realize that I wasn't the bad guy her mother painted me, but just a guy who was a lot greater than my dead wife ever realized. At some point in our discussions, Amy looked at me and said, "You still love her, don't you, Dad? It still hurts when I think of all the contempt she had for me. But you're right, I guess some part of me still loves her." I was not a chicken. I loved her with all my heart, but a long time ago she hurt me to the bone. I did what had to be done to Wendy to save myself from destruction. My attorney dropped a bombshell on us about 2 months into our reconciliation. At dinner with us one night, he asked, "What do you guys want me to do with Wendy's ashes? They have been sitting on a shelf in my office for a very long time." Well, you could have heard a pin drop at the table. The silence was broken by my granddaughter chanting, "Want Nana?" Amy and I looked at each other. "Dad, I guess I thought that since I was in jail when she died, I'd never get the chance to say goodbye. Now that I've met you and heard your story, there are a lot of things I'd like to say to Mom. Some of them not very nice. Can we go get her?" "I guess okay. There are some things I'd like to tell her also, but I'm not apologizing for anything I did to her. After all the years of pain she put me through before she died, she deserved what I did to her. Dad, I'm not saying you did wrong. Remember, I lived with her, and that a-hole that assaulted me and turned me into an addict. They deserved everything you did to them. And while we're on the subject, so did I. I was a bitch toward you. It took me reaching bottom in jail before I started to turn my life around when I realized what I had done to you." Frank interrupted, "Dad, I met her at a halfway house where she was working as a counselor. I was in rehab there for a drinking problem. She was on her way back, and I fell in love with her at that point. She helped me kick my alcohol addiction, and I supported her in her attempts to get clean. We haven't been apart since." Eventually, we all agreed that Vivian should have some sort of a connection with her grandmother, even if it was only to visit a grave site. And it would also serve to give Amy and I a place to go to express our anger at Wendy. Later that day, we got the urn from my attorney's office. I put the urn in the Bentley's trunk, remembering that Wendy never liked riding in the back seat because she got car sick. I hoped the trunk would magnify the effect. I guess I still had a few bad feelings toward my wife. We moved to Virginia, and I bought a small farm outside of a major city. My son-in-law and I agreed to raise a few horses and run a small stable operation where folks from the city could stable their horses and ride them in a country setting. Wendy's ashes would eventually be buried in a small family plot on our farm. The plot contained the remains of a family unit that lived here in the mid-1800s and had once owned part of the property. We cleaned up the plot and erected a small picket fence to enclose it. We left room for a few extra grave sites. The last thing I did was have a headstone made for Wendy. It said, "Wendy Adams, 1956 to 1995, cancer victim. She will be missed by all who loved her. We all forgive you." As the years went by, I noticed that my granddaughter played with her books in that little graveyard a lot. One day I asked her why. "'Cause Grandma talks to me and is helping me learn to read," she said, as if this was a perfectly normal occurrence. "Papa, she says she's sorry she hurt you. Someday she will make it all up to you. She also told me that now she can see what a good man you are and would like you to forgive her. She also asks if she can wait here in the cold and dark until it's your turn. Then she wants to know if you would let her walk into the light with you. That way she could be with you forever." A little voice said in my head, "Also, it was a nice try, William, but I don't get car sick anymore." I dropped to my knees and started hugging Vivian. "Papa, why are you crying?" Dear listeners, please share your thoughts in the comments section below, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.